Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Je suis extrêmement heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour une nouvelle conférence virtuelle du CDDS. I am delighted to welcome you today for a new CLTS virtual talk. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin Barito. I am an associate professor of law and the University Research Chair in Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa, where I lead the university's Center for Law, Technology and Society. For today's virtual talk, I am delighted to host Professor Ari Ezra Waldman to discuss his latest book, Industry Unbound, the inside story of privacy, data, and corporate power, that was just published by Cambridge University Press. And in his book, he explains why privacy law isn't working and shows how tech companies manipulate us, our behavior, and our laws. I highly recommend you to buy the book and read it if you haven't. It's amazing. And that's why I immediately invited Ari to present his book to our community. So Ari Ezra Waldman is a professor of law and computer science and faculty director of the Center for Law, Information and Creativity at Northeastern University. He researches the ways in which law and technology reify traditional structures of power, with particular focus on privacy, law and society, civil rights, and the LGBTQ+ community. He published extensively, he received so many awards, and it's actually the second time that he's coming to Ottawa to present his work in 2018, in the good old days before that amazing pandemic. He delivered a very well-attended Deirdre G. Martin lecture in privacy law at the University of Ottawa, based on his previous book. And so I'm extremely delighted that one more time, Ari, you accepted to add Ottawa to your book tour. Although we would have definitely preferred to host you in person. And so after his talk, Professor Waldman will be joined by Professor Valerie Steeves. Professor Steeves is a CLTS faculty member and a professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences, as well as the principal investigator of the Equality Project. And she will facilitate the conversation with our guest. Do not hesitate to ask your question in the chat. So it's the bubble button at the top of your screen, and Professor Steve will ask them to Professor Waldman. And so, without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Waldman for his presentation, and I'm gonna load your slide in a few seconds.
Well, thank you so much, Florian. While you're, I'm grateful to you for inviting me, and it's always such a pleasure to be here. And I'm so grateful that you are part of our community here in the North America privacy community. So I had a great time coming to the University of Ottawa a couple of years ago, as you said. It's a real pleasure for me to talk about my book here with you all. It seems like it was a really great crowd last time. And I'm looking forward to talking about this with you all. I hope everyone is safe and healthy, and I hope we can be together soon. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes. Hopefully we'll have quite a bit of time for discussion afterwards. And thanks in advance to Valerie Steeves for stepping in to facilitate. So as Florian mentioned, my book is called Industry Unbound. It is based on about 3.5 years of research and fieldwork inside technology companies. I'm going to talk a little bit about methods later, but I want to be upfront about how this research was done. This research was done outside through my own funds, the funds that I raised on my own. There were a lot of companies that didn't allow me to visit. A lot of companies that said that you can talk to us, but you can't quote us. You can only use us on deep background. And there were a lot of companies, there was at least one company that required pre-approval of any quotes that I used in the book. And obviously those kind of things violate researcher ethics. So researching this kind of book is difficult. especially for a community like big tech companies and medium and small tech companies that they know they're doing something. Sometimes they know they're doing something wrong, and they are unwilling to open up their doors to researchers for anyone who might hold them accountable. And that's part of what this story is about. Sometimes we hold people accountable through whistleblowers, right? Whistleblowers are a unique bunch. Like, we know a lot about what's going on in the tech world because of whistleblowers, but they know what they did or what their companies have been or were doing was wrong, right? That's Frances Haugen speaking before the United States Congress. She knows what her employers have been doing to make children and adolescents addicted to Instagram. So she came out, she blew the whistle. She knew what Facebook and Instagram were doing were wrong. One of the things I learned by doing research on this book, and what I talk about in this book, is that the situation is actually much, much worse. Whistleblowers know that what they're doing is wrong. So many people that I spoke to don't just think that what their employers are doing or what they're doing is not wrong. They want to brag about it, right? They are, as I have found, subject to this false consciousness, subject to this idea, are so habituated into thinking that what they're doing is actually pro-privacy, they can't even see how they have been manipulated and co-opted by the structures inside their companies. So we've all seen emails and posts like this where a company says, your privacy is important to us. Or Microsoft's privacy statement, which says your privacy is important to us. Or Facebook that says we're committed to protecting your information and giving you more choices. Or that they say that what you share and who you share it with should be your decision. Or we build tools to give you more control. We can all be forgiven if we give a collective eye roll toward all of these statements. And yet we see them all the time. It's hard to imagine how a company might think that we actually believe that they care about our privacy, or that we really do think that privacy is important to us, or that they're giving us tools to protect our privacy. But these statements are not just throwaway lines from a PR company. These are part of a larger campaign, an intentionally designed campaign to make us think that companies not just care about our privacy, but actually that the way privacy law is structured is actually functioning the way it's supposed to and doing what its job is supposed to do. My argument is, we'll start with the argument. No reason to not hide the ball. What I found during my research is that tech companies leverage the coercive capacities of their organizational structures to normalize 3 steps: to normalize data extractive discourse, compliance, and design. And in so doing, co-opt privacy law and privacy professionals by habituating them into these kind of privacy performances and these everyday practices of their work that seem on the surface to be privacy protective, but in fact are exactly the opposite. So I'll say that again. I'll go into a little bit more detail. Though it's one thing to talk about how technology companies are data extractive, that data is the new oil, or that data is profit, right? We can write books, as my colleague Julie Cohen has, that explains in detail the nature and systems of informational capitalism, and how the political economy of our time has been structured around extracting rents and extracting value from information about us. But those systems don't exist without foot soldiers. If everyone knew how bad the system was, as Julie's book, Between Truth and Power, explains, then why does the system persist, right? Is it because everyone is in on the plan? Everyone doesn't like privacy, that even people who are hired as privacy professionals, that in fact they all dislike and not care about privacy, that they're there just for the paycheck, and they purposely sit in meetings saying, how can we destroy privacy today? I'm sure there are people like that, but that's not the mass of people who do work on the ground. Sure, engineers may not be trained in privacy when they go through their master's and PhD programs and learn coding and programming to build the products that we use every day. But do they sit in meetings and plan, again, in some evil Mr. Burns type style, how to invade privacy today? I'm sure some of them do. I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg sometimes does that, but the mass of people are not like that. In fact, they go to their jobs inside these companies for all the same reasons that we go to our jobs, because they care about what they do, because it's interesting, and certainly also for the paycheck. There are lots of different factors here. But how does a system that is so all-encompassing anti-privacy and data extractive persist when there are lots of people who are working on the ground who don't do their work with all this intent to violate our privacy? And what happens is, inside many of these companies, again, not all, this is not a survey of every single technology company out there, but the tactics that a lot of companies use, or that some companies use, are there to silence privacy voices. Ends up being that we facilitate our own subjugation without knowing it. Every time we click a button that says agree, every time we toggle a button on our toggle consents on our iPhone, every time we engage in what Daniel Sullivan calls privacy self-management, we perpetuate this system that privacy is something we are in charge of, or something that we are responsible for. Privacy professionals who earnestly consider themselves privacy advocates are actually complicit. They go inside these companies and they become co-opted by the structures that they're put into. And they still see themselves as privacy advocates. Many of them earnestly believe that the work that they're doing is super important and super helpful, but they don't see the forest for the trees because of how they've been co-opted by companies. And privacy law in this context is also insufficient. It is designed based on these performances, based on these co-opted anti-privacy performances that companies have been engaging in for decades, which is why statutes like the GDPR and all the proposals for comprehensive privacy legislation in the United States are exactly what industry wants. In the end, my goal with this book is nothing short of a wholesale reshaping of privacy law and the privacy profession. I want to change how we think about and how we do privacy on the ground, including how we think about it. Our goal should be a more liberatory, more emancipatory vision of what privacy and privacy law should be like. So let's think about a little bit about methods. And then I'll detail the argument a little bit more. So as I said, doing this research was pretty difficult when companies refuse access and they don't want to be held accountable. So in an attempt to do an in-depth ethnography of how people actually implement privacy on the ground, both in how the companies talk about privacy, how they apply privacy law, and how they integrate privacy, if at all, into the design of new products, well, I went to talk to the people themselves. It started with a process that sociologists and anthropologists call snowball sampling, where you meet some contacts and they introduce you to other people. But that is a biased sample, so I had to go elsewhere. I reached out to a lot of companies, a lot of contacts. Some companies said no. I was given the opportunity to embed myself inside several companies, mid-sized technology companies that were designing new products. And I was able to, in addition to signing confidentiality agreements about proprietary information, I was able to see how they did their work. I also went to technologist and privacy conferences where I interviewed current and former employees of various different companies. In the end, getting a large sample, more than 120 interviews with lawyers, privacy professionals, programmers and engineers, executives, and so forth. And feel free to, I'm happy to talk more about methods in our Q&A. And what I found is that there are really 3 steps to the ways in which corporate structures co-opt otherwise well-meaning privacy professionals and even privacy engineers into the data extractive goals of data extractive profit-making goals of companies. So the first step is discourse. This is about how companies think about, or how they want us to think about and talk about privacy. Companies ensure, or they do a lot of work to make sure that the dominant discourse among policymakers, among us, among their workers, is this idea that privacy is about giving people control. And you just saw that in the earlier slides. Almost every major technology company, their privacy policy and their privacy notices start with some comment about how we're putting you in control. Privacy is about giving you the tools to be in control of what happens to your data. That is exactly the type of privacy discourse that is anti-privacy, that is co-opting the idea of privacy into something that is more profit-making, more data extractive. And in the book, I talk about a lot of ways in which, a lot of tactics companies use, again, to co-opt their professionals into thinking that privacy is control is a really good idea. And the reason why it's such a bad idea, just as a review for those who might not be steeped in the literature, privacy as control sounds like really good. It sounds autonomy enhancing. But how many websites do you visit every day? How many apps do you have on your phone? You have hundreds and hundreds of consent toggles, hundreds of agree buttons, hundreds of cookie consents to navigate. Control in that sense is illusory. There's no way that we can possibly manage all of the choices we're given in order to control our privacy. So it's a discourse that sounds good, but is in fact data extractive. And the way they do that, the way they encourage their employees and their privacy professionals to believe that privacy as choice and control is a good idea, is they take on these tactics. And there are many of them, some more of which I talk about in the book. I had this great, I don't know about great, but illuminating discussion with several lawyers and a general counsel at a company, where we were talking back and forth about the work that they were doing, all of which was based on transparency, being more transparent about the kind of data that they're collecting. And when I asked, well, what about not collecting information about sexual orientation? Or what about not collecting X amount of information, X information that you're not using for some purpose? And the response was, well, how is transparency bad? Right? How could you even be against transparency? It's almost like saying, how could you be against finding missing children? Transparency was the best thing ever, right? How can it be bad? There's no way you could argue against it. And in fact, you don't argue against it, right? But transparency is just one part of a larger system. But what these companies do is they get their privacy professionals and their lawyers doing work on transparency and choice. Facebook publishes reports on new choices. They publish a report on transparency. TikTok, whose new privacy CPO and new privacy staff recently published a new report on transparency. Everything that they do is about transparency, right? So once you start making your employees think that, well, this is what privacy is, this is what we do, transparency and choice and control become the chief thing, just the chief tools. Another great story happened when I was interviewing the team of lawyers at a company that had specifically made arguments in a recent case in the United States, saying that individual users do not have any privacy on their platform once they share. Once you share information on the platform, you don't have any privacy anymore. That platform was being sued in the United States, in California in particular, for various privacy and data misuse claims under state law. And they had wrote a brief which said, you don't have privacy and you can't have privacy interest in something that you've shared. And yet this company spent about an hour in our meeting previously saying how much they care about privacy. And I specifically asked the general counsel, do you believe that your users have a privacy interest in information they disclose on your platform? And he said yes. And some of his staff went through all the different ways that privacy on information shared on the platform was protected. And then when I showed them the brief, and I said, but didn't you make this argument in this brief, in this case? First, the general counsel stormed out of the room. Absolutely no joke. Second, the deputy general counsel said, well, my clients deserve the best arguments I can make, so I make them. The idea that these companies should absolutely lie, either to me or to users, and hide behind the zealous advocacy canon is a perfect example of how this system works. The zealous advocacy canon, the idea that our clients deserve our best arguments, has nothing to do with privacy, nor does it have anything to do with profit. It's just how you do, it's a canon, it's an idea of just how you do your work, right? So what these companies end up getting their employees to do, what the leadership ends up getting their employees to do, is they take these seemingly innocuous or seemingly understandable mantras like zealous advocacy or privacy is important or so forth, or transparency, and they just make their work entirely subsumed by that idea. They can justify pretty much whatever they want under the idea of zealous advocacy or under the idea of transparency. The second step is law, right? So now that the companies have softened the ground under which we think and talk about privacy, so their workers all think that privacy is choice, control, and transparency is an effective way of dealing with and approaching privacy, how do companies then ensure that compliance with the law will be little more than pushing papers, right? How do you undermine the ability of the law to actually hold them accountable? Again, there are a lot of tactics that these companies use, many of which I talk about in the book. So, and these are, again, all pieces of evidence of false consciousness, such that these privacy professionals don't realize that what they're doing is data extractive. Many of the privacy professionals that I spoke to confused the amount of work they had with impact. Ever since the GDPR, they said, we're busier than ever, right? We have so much going on. I'm working so late. Look at all this work product, this stack of pieces of paper that my office has published over the last year and distributed. We're busier than ever. But then when I asked them, well, how have you actually changed the privacy standards or the privacy technology in the products that you create? No one could point to any examples other than additional choices, additional transparency, new consent toggles. Now, of course, there are examples of this, right? One of Apple's latest iOSs gives you an indication of when an app is tracking your location. Of course, there are examples, but for the most part, most of these privacy professionals, the examples that they gave in terms of impact was about more choice and more control. They transform privacy law, which is supposed to be, at least in the GDPR, which is supposed to be about assessing privacy risks to the consumer. They reframe it, talk about privacy risks to the company, the risk of being sued, right? And in a system like we have today, the risk of being sued is far low. They hobble privacy offices to such that the privacy professionals don't even realize it, that it's a problem. For example, one of the companies that I visited, the privacy department's budget was split between IT, compliance, and law. So whenever the chief privacy officer wanted to do anything, she had to go to one of them to beg for money. Another tactic is not only split the budgets, but also limit the responsibilities of the privacy office. So for example, compliance, which is a key aspect of what corporations do to adhere to the law, was in a separate department. The only thing that the privacy people had any responsibility over were hiring vendors, right? So the actual compliance was someone else's job. The only thing the privacy professional could do was hire vendors to automate privacy, right, inside their company. And also there are other social forces that cause privacy professionals to minimize or silence their advice, right? I can't be the one saying no all the time, or else no one's going to listen to me, because companies keep the jobs of their privacy professionals, of their independent research, of their researchers, of people whose job it is to say no. They keep their jobs precarious. They keep them in a state where you could just easily be fired, just like Google did to its AI ethics team. Right? So these people who don't want to lose their jobs and don't want to lose their stock options, their jobs are precarious, so they moderate their advice. Lots of other traps that these people fall into, all as a result of how the companies structure their organizations. And finally, design. So having softened the ground in terms of how we think about privacy, having undermined the ability of law to hold them accountable, now they are free to design technologies however they want, but still have to prevent privacy from gaining a foothold in the design process. Even as they tell us that now they have all these new privacy engineers and as other academics push their line that privacy is being integrated into design. So what are the tactics that they use to ensure that privacy doesn't have a foothold in the design process? Lots of different things. They split up the design of different products, a single product, into many different teams. Lots of companies do that. That itself, again, it's not itself data extractive. But when you enforce ignorance between the teams, you force each individual team member, each individual engineering team, when they ask a question about, well, who's designing this? They say, don't focus on that. You have a specific job, which means that someone can just always easily say, well, there's always someone else who's working on privacy. But that's not my job. That's not for me to do. Someone else is doing that. As Frances Haugen has said before Congress, they push engagement above all. That is the prime directive inside these companies. And when engagement, the nature, extent, and quality and quantity of time and stuff and things that people do on someone's platform, when that's the #1 priority, other things get pushed to the side. Another experience that I had was talking to engineers about how they integrate privacy, how they work with other stakeholders in the company to do their work, to integrate privacy into design. And we said, when we were put together in a team to figure out how to improve security after it all happened, this quote came after not a security breach, not after a data breach. It came after the company was found out to be using data that it had access to in a way that it promised not to. That's a privacy breach, right? That's not a hack. So what these companies do is they respond to privacy faults, privacy invasions with security fixes. That not only is like a conceptual slippage, but it habituates engineers themselves into thinking, well, they're doing privacy work. In fact, they're just doing security work, and those things are very different. And there are, again, as I said, lots of other tactics that I discuss in the book, all of which are about using the corporate structure to silence privacy voices. A final one I'll mention before concluding is that the people who are going to come across the big privacy questions more often are going to be the engineers as they're designing their tools, right? Several companies that I came across, they don't allow the engineers to go to privacy professionals or the lawyers to ask questions. They only allow the engineers to go to privacy professionals or to privacy lawyers to ask questions when a privacy issue comes up. They don't allow the reverse. They don't allow lawyers to affirmatively go to design teams to be issue spotters or advisors. And in fact, the companies go even further. They require engineers on the ground to speak to their manager, who then speaks to their manager, who then speaks to their product manager, and only then may it go to someone who may have more knowledge about what the privacy problem is with something, meaning that very few issues ever get to someone who has any training in what privacy might be. In the end, very few people realized that they were being manipulated. Their response was always, well, that's just how it is, or that's what privacy law is, or we're doing so much, but what they were doing had no effect. And then finally, the big question is, well, what do we do about it, right? As with anything, books are always works in progress on a longer research agenda. And I think our next step is to really think about what privacy law might look like if we wanted to think about real structural change. If you wanted to think about creating a legal system or creating a society in which we are emancipated from the manipulation of these companies, and not just us, but also their workers. So thank you very much. I talked a little bit longer than I thought I would, but that is my dog Peabody sitting next to my book. It's a pleasure to speak with you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks for that, Ari. That was just fantastic. We had a brief discussion before where I just said I'm a big fan of this work, and now that I've met your dog, I like it even better. I'm also a big fan of qualitative work, actually. I think that there's incredible power in these social science snapshots of what's happening on the ground. So my first question, before I get into the meat and potatoes of the law and privacy itself, is as a researcher, when you're sitting down having these conversations, what surprised you the most?
So I think what surprised me the most is for some people, the combination of bragging about stuff that's awful, right? So it's that realization that got me thinking about this idea of false consciousness. Like, it's one thing to brag about really good stuff that you're doing. Like, it's one thing, you know, Florian got a great job and is doing amazing work at the University of Ottawa. He should absolutely brag about that. It's quite another thing for someone to brag about how they made their privacy policy longer to 10,000 words because it was more detailed, and how they gave us 20 more options, 20 more toggles to click, or how they're giving us more control by giving us many more consent options, or brag about how they're doing so much work, right? How they're so busy and then unable to absolutely point to a way they're having impact. That moment, there were so many moments. The moment the guy walked out of the room, right?
I wondered if that was going to be
the moment, and what I didn't mention was how he waited for me at the elevator bank before I left, saying, you know, saying how I was engaging in gotcha research and how he's just trying to do his job and transparency isn't bad. And my response was, you left the room. Like, I was happy to talk. And then again, just leaves in a huff. So the remarkable ability to brag about something and then get very defensive when someone challenges you. It's just was a pattern over and over and over again.
Oh, that's really interesting. Do you know, it's one of the things that I'm really wondering about, actually, because I think that does reflect that false consciousness. I'm wondering how false that false consciousness actually is, because the defensiveness indicates, I know at some level, that what I'm doing is not what I say that I'm doing. And I just wonder if that can be applied to policymakers as well. I mean, you kind of leave us with that question of what should we do next? How do we resolve this? And it seems to me that there's also good qualitative evidence that policymakers are playing the same game. If you look at the convention, the European conventions in the 1970s, the very first one speaks to discrimination and the social value of privacy. And within 12 months, you know, governments and industry had mobilized to get in there and say, whoa, we need access to data, so you can't talk about discrimination. So I just wondered, did you see any connections with that? Do you see that the way that this discourse that's generated by the industry is playing out in policy for as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are so many pieces there. So let me break it down. So in terms of the false consciousness, I think that awareness that something is going wrong, there's more of that at the GC level, at the executive level. The true false consciousness, where people really think that they're doing something good, is where the people are really habituated into thinking that this is their work. So a lot of that defensiveness at the GC level and the executive level, less so at the analyst and the worker level. But to your point about policymakers, so there is undoubtedly a multi-gazillion-dollar system where these companies are mobilizing to undermine the law. That's one thing. Mm-hmm. But there is far more work being done much more subtly, right? So how can one explain that all of the privacy laws, all of the proposed privacy laws in the United States for comprehensive privacy legislation all roughly look the same? And how can we explain that vision of that, you know, individual rights, again, making us feel like privacy is our responsibility, and internal compliance monitoring, which is so easy to co-opt? How is it possible that even progressives, even people who say that they care about privacy, feel that that's the way to go? And I think some of this, as you say, maybe false consciousness is coming into play there. One argument is that, well, we're just habituated into thinking that, and that's one thing. But also, a lot of the arguments that come at the same time is, so if you want more restrictions, that means you hate detecting cancer, or you hate finding missing kids, or you want China to win, right? So yeah, of course, AI and data can help us to a certain extent find cancer. right? In ways that we weren't, the naked human eye might not have been able before. We're not there yet, but also where we are is we may only be able to find that cancer in white men, and we can't find it elsewhere. So I'm not too super keen on integrating and using this technology or being justified or seeing that as a justification for lax privacy regulation when the system sucks, when the system is awful, right? So there is a recognition that the system that they're creating is somehow needs other justifications, and other justifications very much like the one, like rhetorical ones that you can never respond to, right? Do you hate finding missing kids?
Well, it's interesting that you raise kids, because in the research we've done in the Canadian context, kids are a big part of this because we're doing it for the kids. They're going to be the information workers of the future. We're going to teach them how to do code so they can be free in the world that we're building for them. But as policy goes on, kids are then presented as at risk. So you have to put them under surveillance because they could see some porn or be talked to by someone. But then as the discourse continues, kids become the risk because they bully each other and they send sex and they do all this other stuff. So we need more surveillance. So you get that. There's a really nice interplay between the false consciousness and also the false poster children.
Yes, that's such a good point, and something I don't talk about in the book enough, but it's always about the kids, right? Ned Flanders' wife, won't someone please think of the children, based on Anita Bryant from the 1970s, right? So it's always about the kids. So content moderation disproportionately restricts access to queer content because kids, right? So we need access to data because kids, right? So there's so much bad stuff that has been justified in the name of doing something for kids, when in fact you're doing it for you, so you and your people can make money. So I totally agree with that. And if you haven't, if you're thinking about writing that paper or connecting your work you've already done about kids to privacy discourse, I would absolutely encourage you to do that if you haven't already.
I'll send you some stuff. A lot of the questions in the chat box so far have sort of been looking at this whole notion of false consciousness, and also some questions about human rights. So I'm picking up on Vivek Krishnamurthy's questions in two ways. The first one is, can you talk a little bit about your position on the GDPR? And the reason I'm asking is because so often we look at Europe and we say Europe has better laws because they have data protection, but they also have human rights protections. And that these human rights conventions and these broader commitments give us a way of getting out of the privacy as control box, because privacy is about autonomy, but it's also about identity, freedom from discrimination, privacy in public spaces, social relationships, democracy, all these other kinds of things. So I know you speak to the GDPR in your book, but I was wondering if you could expand a bit. Is the GDPR the way to go? Do we need to tweak data protection, or is it time to go back to basics and come up with a completely different approach to privacy?
Yeah, great question. And I see there's a lot more to so many of the questions in the chat, so hopefully we'll have time. So I think the GDPR is already a failure. The GDPR was conceptually a failure. The idea that this phrase binary governance, which is a phrase from my colleague Margot Kaminsky, the idea that binary governance, individual rights, internal compliance could ever function, even at its best, right? So Margot's, Professor Kaminsky's critique of the GDPR is that it's collaborative governance, but messed up, right? There's no transparency. There's no role for civil society to hold companies accountable. There's less role for public governance to hold companies accountable. But even at its best, this form of binary governance that's envisioned by the GDPR is still reliant on, not just reliant on internal compliance structures, but still is agnostic in many cases as to the substance of the data that's being collected. Sure, there are these human rights obligations outside, but the GDPR says that as long as you have one of these legitimate bases, and by the way, consent is one of the legitimate bases, and the data shows that most companies, even though there are 5 others, most companies do rely on consent. So the GDPR is not 100% a consent-based regime, but in practice, it's like 80% a consent-based regime. So that's not any different. But once companies have a legitimate basis and they just follow these rules, right? They just follow these internal compliance rules about hiring this person, having these records. And then you have these other provisions like privacy by default and by design that have no meat on them whatsoever, that have no specificity and no way to really enforce them. So the GDPR is, in that sense, a failure. It is a product, no matter how European advocates slice it, it is a product of neoliberal governmentality. This idea that that industry is part of their own governance. And that their success is our success. So that's my assessment of the GDPR. Even at its best, I think it's a failure.
So, which leads in really nicely to two of the other questions in the chat. Constantine asked, are there any models of law that you would say are emancipatory? And again, drawing on Vivek's comments, to what extent is the squishy nature of privacy law the root cause of these failures? What about other kinds of compliance like environmental law where we have more defined rules and standards? Are there models that we can draw from? Where do we go from here?
Really good. So the environmental example shows how it's not the squishy nature of privacy that's the problem, right? We have specific rules in the environmental world, and yet the environmental regulation in the United States in particular has been totally handed off to companies in this, again, neoliberal governmentality. So, and in fact, these companies have a very clear definition of what they want privacy to be, and it's compliance in service of a very clear definition. So it's not about squishiness. And I also resist the premise of the question. Privacy is not squishy. Companies want us to think that it is squishy, and therefore we should rely on this definition of it, right? So the bigger question then, what do we do about this? What are some legal approaches? What are some approaches to law that are more emancipatory? And we need to think outside the privacy box. Everyone who's thinking about privacy law, they're thinking about a reform of the GDPR, a new GDPR, this, or that, whatever. Real emancipatory or liberatory privacy law is not just about data. It's about labor, right? We need labor protections for researchers inside companies, right? We need environmental protections. These companies are disrupting delicate ecosystems because they want to bury wire and tubes under the oceans in order to transfer data, right? It doesn't just like fly in the sky, right? Like they have to damage ecosystems in order to make their multinational business model work. We need to think about privacy in terms of civil rights, right? So think about discrimination and protect marginalized populations from an anti-subordination perspective. We need anti-competition law. So whether that's breaking up companies, maybe, but again, none of these things can exist in a vacuum. So great labor protections are going to be pointless to protect our privacy if we have no actual limits on data collection. Limits on data collection are going to be pointless unless we have true public governance. So when we think about what a liberatory approach might be, is we have to think more broadly. We also have to dismantle what one scholar has called bureaucracies of violence. Like ICE is a bureaucracy of violence, right? It's a system of bureaucracy that exerts violence on marginalized populations. In ICE's case, expatriates from other countries living in the United States. Data in their hands leads to marginalization, leads to violence. We have to dismantle those bureaucracies rather than just limit their access to data for it. Because if those bureaucracies still exist and the data still exists, then we're going to create problems. We have to dismantle both systems in order for us to be emancipated from corporate control.
Two of the comments in the comment box raise similar questions. And it's really, we'd like to get a sense of, given the research that you did, were there any positive or constructive approaches to supporting that kind of substantive approach to privacy that came out of your discussions? Are there companies that are doing things that will help us get there? And if so, what are they?
So
not necessarily what are the companies, but what are the practices that are going to get us there?
So instead of creating 2 options here, let's create 3. Are there any companies that are doing work that would help us reach what I'm calling this more liberatory or emancipatory privacy law? No, right? That is not part of the Overton window. That's not even being considered by even the most progressive people, or even the companies that claim to care as much about privacy. But then there's the opposite, like these companies that are doing bad things. We talked about that, and then there's and then there is the gray area in the middle. Are there any companies that are at least trying to do their best? Like, are there companies that are pushing past this privacy as control? Are there any companies that are, taking small steps? So, sure, there are examples of, even in the companies that were doing bad things, there are examples of people that are trying. So for every person that said, I'm a privacy advocate and I get worried every time someone talks about privacy as anything other than choice, there was a privacy professional who recognized that privacy is about you trusting us with your data, and that imposes some affirmative obligations on us. Whether fiduciary duties is the right answer, which flows from trust, is far more complex, because you can't just turn on a light switch and then impose create fiduciary duties and have those interpreted by the kinds of pro-corporate courts that we have in the United States and other countries right now. So there's that. So yes, there are hints of other views that could exist, right? That's exactly why companies use their bureaucratic structures to silence those voices, right? It's because there are those hints that the bureaucracy becomes so all-encompassing.
Yeah, which kind of goes back to that. I'm going to stand up and walk away from this table, but get to you at the elevator, because I'm going to silence you on that. But I also want to discipline you so you get back onto the program, because we're all good guys here. Yeah, it's really interesting. It really leads into the next question from Abigail, because in your talk you talked about how some of these things are just the way law is practiced or the way commerce is practiced in late capitalism. So Abigail's looking at the content, your comments about co-opting or manipulating the privacy professionals within the corporate structure. We know that they have duties of confidentiality under the GDPR. We know they have professional obligations as lawyers, and sometimes can these be used to promote exactly what you're talking about, a silencing of alternatives? And the example she gives is like with big tobacco.
Interesting. So it's not conflicting out outside counsel or conflicting out different stakeholders is not something that I explicitly saw in my research, which is why I couldn't talk about it. Again, this is based on ethnography, so it's just from what I see. But it's a similar idea, right? So you can't have any firms arguing against us because we've hired all of those firms, right? So the bigger question here might be, or a similar question from that to what I saw, is how companies have co-opted the International Association of Privacy Professionals. So the IAPP is basically a trade union of privacy professionals. It's super expensive to join. Companies usually pay your membership for privacy professionals, and they have conferences. And the IAPP provides a service for these privacy professionals. In this profession, like some others, but very much unlike others, because we're existing, especially in the United States, at the vanguard of an area of practice, they come together and they share ideas. That has a couple of effects. One of the things that it means that the biggest companies generally push the standards of best practice. Another thing is that there's a lot of sharing. There's a lot of dissemination of similar ideas throughout the field. And that's a service, right? There's no doubt about that, right? You can imagine, that's why academics come to conferences. We share ideas, we learn from each other. It's absolutely salient. But industry has co-opted the IAPP. And I have said that at talks sponsored by the IAPP. Not where I get many money, but where they sponsor the talk. IAPP conferences are funded in part by privacy vendors, from OneTrust to these companies that supposedly datify or computerize compliance. They spend thousands of dollars to sponsor these conferences. And the IAPP publishes these glowing reports about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of vendors that are doing automated privacy compliance, with no hint of any concern that automating your privacy compliance is exactly the problem, right? If you can automate your GDPR compliance, right? GDPR compliance must not be really that good. Or you can automate it in meaning that you're not really doing what you're supposed to. You're just doing kind of Mad Libs privacy compliance, right? So in addition, these companies are the source of the IAPP's money, right? So I did a discourse analysis of the IAPP's blog. It's called the Privacy Advisor, and there's also a Privacy Perspectives. So I wrote a little program, and I did kind of a natural language processing thing, and I scraped randomly hundreds of articles from each of the verticals, and then did a discourse analysis of them. And the vast majority of these articles, whatever they're talking about, and I remember the figure correctly, it's something like by a 3-to-1 margin, push the idea of privacy as control or choice or transparency, right? So even an article that is talking about Brian Schatz's proposal from 2018 of a data fiduciary law, right? The law is 100% about affirmative obligations under the fiduciary principle.
Absolutely.
The article was focused on had quotes on and was focused on how privacy as choice and giving people control over their information is a more effective, is an effective or better approach to privacy. Given that, right, like the IAPP is part of this system. The IAPP is part of this system that is co-opting privacy professionals.
Well, I want to highlight Konstantin's comment after this discussion. He says, Ari, it makes me reflect differently on my frustrations that I experienced as a privacy officer. So I think that's a particularly important intervention. There, I lost you for a second. Do you know, the other thing I wanted to talk about actually was the need, you talk about in your book a lot about the need to regain civil control of the discourse as a whole. And the example, you're frozen in my, no, you're back. Sorry, you were frozen on my screen for a bit. The example I want to give is actually a project run by UNICEF. So they're one of the partners in the Equality Project. We do a lot of research on kids' privacy, promoting kids' privacy, but we do it from a child rights point of view, where we're trying to not just protect kids from harm, but give them tools so they can participate in a decision-making process and shape the world around them as agents, right? So very much grounded in this work on human rights. They've recently begun a project on AI and kids, and it's a public-private partnership, government of Finland, and a number of major tech companies who are building AI systems. And their educational outreach is basically teaching kids that AI, you know, the benefits they're going to get from AI, and that if they want to exercise power in that society, then they need to learn how to code. When they held a workshop where they were introducing, you know, the results of the work that they've done, and they're doing it, I think, with good intentions. And they asked all of the people that participated, what's your biggest concern? And I'd say 80% of the people wrote privacy. This is privacy invasive. What about privacy? What are you doing? This is violating privacy. And the response from the people who are running the project, who are computer scientists and engineers, what are you talking about? We've programmed that in. So how do we get control back over the civil discourse when when even human rights organizations are now participating in this privacy as control commodification stream?
Yeah, so there are a couple of issues there. Like this is a particular non-governmental organization controlled by engineers and computer and techies, right? So I'm hesitant to think that I would hesitate to think that they are coming at it from a human rights perspective, whatever UNICEF or whatever a bigger organization may say, right? So I'm skeptical of all of these learn to code in order to succeed in the future programs, because they divorce coding and technology from the liberal arts, from critique, from dissent, from accountability, from all of the tools that we need in order to think clearly. And that's exactly what tech companies want to do. Eric Schmidt wants to create a whole educational system where we feed children into coding coding factories, and then they come out on the other end not able to think about anything other than the engineering problem that's in front of it. That is the ideal tech company employee, right? Unable to think about the problems in front of them. So how do we take back this discourse? Well, one of the things that almost all of my colleagues say when it comes to privacy is that they want to change the discourse, but they all say, but choice is important. It just has to be part of a larger system. I say no. It's absolutely time for us to stop forever thinking about, talking about, or even and conceptualizing privacy in terms of anything related to choice and control. The moment it enters, it co-ops. The moment the idea of privacy as choice or autonomy is part of a discussion, it becomes the whole discussion. It's almost like how discussions about diversity, as soon as you mention diversity, it prevents the conversation from being about anti-Black racism, and it allows the conversation to be about literally anything else, right? Or anything else other than what you're supposed to be discussing. So we have to stop that. And anyone who maintains that that connection is complicit in this problem. We need other types of civil society, right? So the organizations that we have on the ground supposedly engaging in creating a social movement for privacy, we have this organization. We have the Future of Privacy Forum, which is basically a pro-industry organization. We have the Electronic Frontier Foundation, libertarian organization. We have EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, a little bit more independent, focusing on creating a new privacy agency. We have the Center for Democracy and Technology, very middle of the road, kind of Brookings Institute light, very middle of the road, trying to get bipartisan appeal for just whatever. These are not the systems, these are not the organizations that we need in place in order to create a movement from the ground up. My model for thinking about the future of privacy is what Andre Gores called non-reformist reforms. Non-reformist reform is a step along the way to true structural change, but that arise from the ground up, from true social movements that raise individual or worker consciousness. None of those movements, none of those organizations are raising individual consciousness about data manipulation. The types of organizations that are things like Data for Black Lives, which links privacy to anti-subordination and Black civil rights. Every community should have an organization like that. There should be a queer privacy group. There should be a women's privacy group. They should, and of course, so on and so forth. And each of these organizations have to resist the pressures that come with civil society about being close to power. The Algorithmic Justice League is a really good example. I just saw that in the chat. The Indigenous Data Sovereignty Movement. These are really good examples. But these should be the sources of draft legislation. These should be the sources of solutions, not FPF, not Center for Democracy and Technology, the state organizations that have approached privacy from what can we do such that we can bring industry along? Well, industry is going to come along when you force them to.
We can regulate them.
Yes.
That's what regulation's for. Yeah, My Data Global was mentioned, as was the Indigenous data sovereignty groups. There are a number of really interesting things in that regard going on in Canada. You know, you're preaching to the choir. I completely agree with what you said, particularly about data justice as a grassroots movement. One of the things that I found really interesting in the last 5 or 6 years of doing qualitative research with young people and people in their 20s, even people in their 30s, when it comes to their use of network technologies, is that there's a real fatigue. That what we're seeing now is that, I mean, people online know that they're under surveillance. We just saw a stat that 80% of people don't say what they think online because they know somebody is recording them. You're the exception in this case because we're recording you. But that you know, they know that they're going to be judged. They know that those like buttons are going to be used against them. They know they're being fed algorithms that shape what they see. And certainly we've seen a move to kind of away from looking at these technologies as a way for us to communicate together and act politically in the ways that you described, and instead watch YouTube videos. It's really becoming more of a very passive entertainment medium, as far as I can tell. And it seems to me that if we're going to get into that data justice mode, we have to do something about it. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Well, so I don't want anyone to think that my goal here is that we have to shut down all the technology that we have right now, right? So my nephew has learned all sorts of amazing magic tricks from YouTube, right? YouTube can be really helpful in certain areas. So what do we do? So just the fact that these people and some activists on the ground, or people who want to be activists on the ground, use Google. I mean, that doesn't tell me enough. What I want to happen, these people are existing in the world, right? We all have to exist in the world. And we can't become hermits. We can't become Luddites. So what do we do instead? I think that research has shown that young people do care a lot about privacy, but they care a lot about privacy within the ways that our society and technology companies and informational capitalism are structured today. That is just what you're saying. They know some things are going to happen, but they are actively doing everything that they can, sometimes subversively and sometimes through the rules, to create some space for themselves, whether it's a fake Instagram account, whether it's limiting disclosure, whether it's using Signal, whatever, right? They're in the world, but they're making specific choices. And the way to engage on privacy is to engage it through another angle. These students, these young people are also passionate about queer rights, right? Engage privacy through there, right? Because you're not going to create a social movement that says you can't use Google Docs anymore, right? You're not going to create a social movement by saying you can't use Grindr anymore. You can't use a hookup app or a dating app anymore. That's not going to create a new world. What is going to create a new world is leverage passions for an equitable world and highlight, which is something our movements for civil rights are not doing, the ways in which data extraction erodes civil rights.
Mm-hmm. I just have to point out that Vivek Krishnamurthy just said that listening to your talk is turning him into a radical. So congratulations, well done you. But makes a point too that a lot of our discussion is a larger critique of the neoliberal orientation of the international human rights movement, and so much of what your work does is draw these larger, broader social movements into conversation in a way that gives us a really good chance of getting a better understanding of what's going on here. I'm just looking at we have 2 more minutes.
There's a point in the chat from Constantine who mentions that there are increasingly technology tools for people to fight back, audit, limit data collection, obfuscate, and help to manage the challenge that 1 million consents control present. So I'm a little confused, because sure, there are technologies that allow people to manage their privacy, but the point is that it shouldn't be about us hiding ourselves from companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
This system it is a natural outgrowth of the system that we exist in for the creation of tools to push back for individuals to use to protect their privacy, like a VPN or whatever, right? Or to obfuscate. So that natural outgrowth is filling a demand that is created by a warped informational capitalism. But what's missing and what's not the case, and this is, I guess, we don't have time to dive into it, but it's not the case that what I don't understand about the comment is that to manage the challenge that 1 million consents or call present, well, there are no tools to help that other than automating consents, right? So, you want to design a bot that's going to click the same cookie consents buttons on every website. That's great. But shouldn't the law allow you to do that at the browser level? Or shouldn't the law just simply say companies cannot collect third-party cookies or performance cookies for advertising purposes, including certain information? So I get that technology exists out there, but that's not a response to anything that I'm saying. I'm saying that we shouldn't need that. I want to create a society where there is no demand for that, because there's no need for it, because the society and the public governance systems that we have in place limit technology platforms to only pursuing data collection on our terms, not theirs.
We've just run out of time. I just wanted to say thank you for a fascinating conversation. I'm really looking forward to the next book, and it's wonderful to see such excellent work being done in the field.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure. Sorry we couldn't get to every question, but you can certainly continue the discussion in the book, reading the book, and also on Twitter. You can find me at Ari Ezra Waldman on Twitter. And find the book for favorite independent local bookstore.
Perfect. And I just shared again the link in the chat for those who have yet to order the book. Again, you should read it. It's amazing. So thank you so much, Ari, for your talk. And yeah, you know that you have friends at the University of Ottawa, at the center, at CPIC. Like we are with you in the Canadian context. That is not that different from the US context, especially regarding privacy law, contrary to what most people try to make us believe, as Val highlighted. So thank you so much, Val, for facilitating the conversation and highlighted some of the amazing work that you did with the Equality Project. And I could have continued for like hours or so with my own comments. And on Policymakers, playing the same game, you asked the question, Val, I answered, oh, yes.
Yes. It was kind of a sentence, right?
A little bit of a lob.
Yeah, I think that BC11 was the proof of this. Anyway, amazing talk, amazing conversation. And yeah, like privacy is more than just data breach. Cybersecurity is just more than data breach. And so to continue that conversation, actually, I would invite all of you to come back with us next week for an event titled The Security of Self with Susie Dunn, Emily Laidlaw, Atima Shatan, and Adam Molnar. Oh. And we will discuss the technical, societal, and legal dimension of the security of self, saying that cybersecurity is not just data breach, it's protection of identity. It's the dating apps, and that we need to discuss. It's Grindr, OnlyFans, the kind of platforms that when you discuss in class, people look at you like, oh, it did. Yes, we need to discuss this because this is what this is the living experience of people online. It's not just the Facebook and the Google. There is more than this. So again, thank you so much, Ari, and I look forward to host you for your next book talk, maybe next year in person.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much, Valerie. I really appreciate your expert facilitating and your fantastic questions. Thank you, Florian, for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming. It's been such a pleasure being, at least virtually, with you all. Hopefully in person next time.
Of course. Bye-bye.
Bye.